Hello, everyone, and welcome to the premiere episode of Big Ideas in Cannabis here on the Beard Bros Media Network. Thank you so much for tuning in with us today. Big Ideas is a place where we talk about current trends, new technology, and other revolutionary ideas that are sure to impact the future of the cannabis industry. I'm your host, Cassie Tomaselli. I am the founder and creative director of Tomaselli Media, which is a boutique content marketing agency focused primarily on cannabis and other purpose-driven brands. We focus on branding, content, thought leadership, and targeted PR in this space. And I'm thrilled to introduce our very first guest, Leah Heise. Leah is a partner at Wolfmeyer, an advisor for Kearney, and the CEO of Gemini Twin Consulting. Leah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Cassie. I really appreciate it.
So our prompt for today's episode is, how will the overruling of Chevron impact the cannabis industry? And I can't wait to dive into this topic with you, Leah. But first, could you just provide our audience with a brief background on your journey to cannabis and how you help businesses in this market?
Sure. So for this particular podcast, I'm going to go way far back, further back than I would normally go in sort of my cannabis career to give context as to why I have any level of credibility to talk about Chevron. So my background is I was a prosecutor and a regulator for the federal government, and I worked for the United States Coast Guard and the National Marine Fisheries Service, NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, prosecuting people who killed, harmed, and harassed marine mammals and also violated commercial fishery regulations. I also acted in the capacity as a regulator working with fishery management councils to develop very comprehensive regulations for the commercial fisheries industry and operated under Chevron. In 2001, I got very, very sick with a disease called chronic pancreatitis and told that I was not going to live 5 years, and went home to then my 18-month-old twins to take care of them, and lived that way until about 2013, in and out of the hospital, very sick, obviously survived, thankfully. Many hospitalizations, lots of opiate pain medication, until finally in 2013, one of my doctors recommended that I tried cannabis. Cannabis had just become medically legal, even though there was no commercial market for it yet in the state of Maryland, where I live. And so I started to do a bunch of research on what it was capable of doing for the body in terms of reducing inflammation and reducing my pain, as well as exploring it as a possibility of re-entering into a career in the cannabis industry. Cannabis, thankfully, has done incredibly for my whole body. I have not been hospitalized with pancreatitis since 2016, which for me is a very long time, and I am not on any opiate pain medication. So for me, it has been absolutely life-changing in terms of my health and also in terms of my career. I entered cannabis in 2015. I applied for a vertical license in the state of Maryland. I was awarded a dispensary. I proceeded to get that dispensary open and ended up selling that dispensary to Forefront Ventures. Going inside of Forefront Ventures as their chief experience and chief compliance officer, and helping to scale them to a public exit in 2 years and 2 months. I then went to Ascend Wellness Holdings as their chief administrative officer and helped to scale them in 18 months to a public exit. And for the last 3 years, I've been consulting both with Kearney and with my own consulting company, Gemini Twin Consulting, and recently with Wolfmeyer. I've partnered up with a great partner out of Northern California named Anna Ray Grabstein, and we have been consulting on strategic scale, regulatory policy, due diligence, qualitative due diligence, and essentially helping people scale to exit.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for sharing, especially the personal side of that story as well, because cannabis touches us all in so many different ways, but especially too learning the intersection of your previous career and how it relates specifically to the topic that we're addressing here today. That's exactly why we wanted to talk to you as our resident expert here on Chevron. So I just kind of want to paint a brief picture here. when we were preparing for this interview, we were talking a little bit about how cannabis businesses can sometimes get so granular. They're responding to the right here and now. They're dealing with very local and industry-specific challenges. And while cannabis businesses are pretty familiar with initiatives at the federal level, like the Safe and Safer Act, the MORE Act, reviews about Schedule 3, and so on, sometimes they're not quite as in tune with some of the bigger macro trends we're seeing in the political sphere. So from your lens, why is it really important for the industry to kind of zoom out and really take account of some of these bigger macro events that could affect our industry?
Sure. I mean, I think the macro events are important, one, from just a day-to-day management perspective, but also from really looking forward towards a strategic exit. What is your long-term goal in this industry? And watching what is going on in the political arena, what's going on in the legislative arena, and the judicial arena can really help you define your strategy in terms of what your go forward is and also your day-to-day. I mean, we see it right now sort of in the division between hemp and cannabis. And as the hemp markets start to get more regulated in states, we're also seeing a lot of litigation in that area that successfully is overturning those. So it is a very difficult path to navigate in cannabis on a sort of more global perspective, and you have to really be dialed into what is going on in all branches of government to make sure that you have your path charted out and are ready to pivot if you have to.
Absolutely. And so specifically, the legal sphere in our cannabis community has been talking a lot about the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to overrule the 1984 Chevron USA versus Natural Resources Defense Council case earlier this year. So can you give us some background on the Chevron case? And at a high level, why does this case in particular have the cannabis industry's ears perked up right now?
Sure. So essentially, what Chevron was a judicial deference case. And, for legal nerds out there, those are the types of people who might have been very, very interested in this type of case. But what happened was way back when, the entire executive branch of the government is managed by something called administrative agencies. So, example, the agency that I worked for, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, that agency is under a variety of statutes authorized to enforce and develop regulations under the statutes under which they are provided enabling authority. For example, the Magnuson Act, which is the act under which this most recent case, Loper, came into existence to overturn Chevron. I'm going to back up a minute. Sorry, we may have to edit this.
No problem, Leah.
Okay, so I'm going to back up a little bit. I want to do this in layman's terms. So when you're going to court as anyone, let's say it's an administrative agency and I am charging you with violating, let's say, a commercial fisheries statute. And I'm saying that you took too many cod in the period of time that you were supposed to be taken. As a prosecutor inside of that administrative agency, I would have the benefit of judicial deference, a high standard of judicial deference, under the Chevron ruling way back when, a very high standard. So you would, from a proof standpoint, I would not have to prove very much to prove that you were guilty of that allegation. And then when you appeal that allegation, because of that deference, it's highly unlikely that a court would overturn the administrative law judge's determination in that case. And what has happened over the years is many respondents, as we called them, would fight against this, claiming that the enforcement authority sitting inside of administrative agency creates a bias against the very people that they are supposed to be protecting. So that's kind of what we've been seeing for the last 40 years since the Chevron case came about, was corporations and respondents and people on the sides, on the outside, those bodies that were being regulated by an industry or by the enforcement agency, were claiming that there's a bias there. And depending on what side of the table you were sitting on, I may or may not agree. If I'm inside of a federal agency and I'm acting as a regulator, I liked having the benefit of Chevron because I knew that when I was bringing a case forward and when I was making a determination of whether or not to prosecute a case and doing an analysis of whether or not on appeal this case may be overturned, having that Chevron deference out there made it far less likely that my case was going to be overturned regardless of the facts. On the other side of the house, if I was a respondent and I was a counsel for the respondent, I wouldn't like Chevron because Chevron gave too much deference to an agency in their creation of their own regulations and in the enforcement of those regulations. Is that clear as mud?
It is. And as you mentioned, it really depends on which side that you're sitting on. And this decision really just kind of flips that 40-year precedent on its head. So, given your experience as a former prosecutor, given your experience with NOAA and specifically these agencies that have kind of been tied up in this decision, what do you think the more direct and immediate impact that the overruling of Chevron will have in the cannabis industry right now?
Sure. I think immediately it's going to slow down rescheduling. And I think we've already seen that, right? We've seen a move towards a hearing that we may or may not have gotten due to the fact that the agency itself, as they are sitting back and they're answering the comments that they have to answer that came with the proposed rule, and they're doing the considerations of moving forward with the rescheduling process, I think we're going to see it take longer than it may have taken if they had Chevron to rely on. I certainly, sitting inside of an agency and doing that process, would be really careful to be dotting my I's and crossing my T's.
Absolutely. Can you just expound on that a little bit of what that would mean by dotting your I's and crossing your T's before you take action?
Sure. You're going to make sure that you have the statutory authority to do what you say you're doing. You're going to make sure that every single comment that's been put forth, and I think there was over 63,000 comments that were put forth, which is an incredible amount of comments, that you have categorized them, that you have answered them in a responsive manner, because what you don't want to do is open yourself up to further litigation. And we're already going to see more litigation because of the lack of Chevron. But you don't want to open yourself up to litigation that you're going to lose, right? Because even inside of an agency, you are making determinations based on your budget. So whether or not you take a case forward or whether or not you take a promulgation of a regulation forward in an aggressive manner will depend on the budget it's going to take to get through all of the judicial processes. And with an agency no longer being able to rely on Chevron, it's going to be a more onerous process on the judicial landscape.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, just slow things down tremendously, not just on rescheduling, but many different issues within the cannabis industry potentially.
Everywhere. The Farm Bill, labor laws, any place that a regulatory agency would touch, and we are touched both on a federal level and on a state level. There's also potential state implications for this because there are states that have incorporated the Chevron doctrine into their structures. So we'll need to think about those as well. And there were further rollbacks in that last Supreme Court session of administrative law generally, of an agency's ability to issue civil penalties, of an agency's ability to take forth all types of different enforcement actions. So I think that whole administrative law landscape is something that we need to be watching carefully in the industry, primarily because from an industry standpoint, it provides us with a lot of opportunities.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of opportunities, and you mentioned the Farm Bill, so I really would like to kind of talk about the hemp cannabinoid market. How does this decision impact this kind of new and emerging and sometimes controversial market, as well as, if we can talk a little bit more too about the impact of Schedule 3?
Sure. I think in terms of the Farm Bill, one, we're waiting for Congress to enact legislation to reenact the Farm Bill. They did not take the action that they were supposed to take. Right now, we're sort of sitting in limbo. And what happens is the DEA and the FDA will issue these opinions saying THCA flower is illegal or Delta 8, Delta 9 is illegal. But there's some real opportunity there to challenge whether or not they even have the authority to say that anymore. And because Chevron does not provide any level of deference or the same Chevron deference level to these federal agencies, there's an opportunity to attack these types of statements. We haven't seen any regulations out of the federal government in terms of any of the cannabinoids. And we've seen FDA go back and forth with Congress saying we don't have authority to regulate it. And I think that's a conversation that we will continue to see, because without Chevron, they're already saying they don't have the right and authority to regulate CBD, for example. But now without Chevron, they're going to push even further for legislative action, which again is going to slow things down, because as we've seen, we can't even get Congress to pass a budget, much less pass a very narrow issue in their mind on hemp cannabinoids or on cannabis generally.
Right. It's not certainly their top priority. So kind of understanding that landscape too, I think is really important. You had also mentioned, Leah, the impact to labor laws earlier, and I just was wondering if maybe you can expound on that a little bit as well.
So, and I'm blanking on the case, but there's already been an impact to labor laws from an appeals court in relation to the lack of Chevron deference. Essentially, there's a variety of different groups that are going to be impacted by the lack of Chevron, right? Like I talk about which side of the table you're sitting on, and we've talked a little bit about the regulator versus the industry, right? But then we also have the consumer, and we also have us as humans. So at the end of the day, without the Chevron deference, for example, we could see really bad labor laws or labor laws that are beneficial to the employee being overturned because there is no longer Chevron deference, and we're starting to see some of that. Same with environmental issues, things particulate matter for air quality control, particulates going into the water under like Clean Water Act, other statutes, RCRA. I mean, there's so many potential environmental impacts. So, holistically, numerous types of people are going to be either adversely affected by this or positively affected by this, depending on where you're sitting. If you are a corporation and you want to release more particulate matter into the air, and you know that EPA is unlikely to win a case against you under the Clean Air Act because they don't have Chevron deference, you're going to push forward not only in releasing that particulate matter, but also in suing the agency for their authority. Similarly, labor laws.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very fascinating and interesting to see how this will potentially play out in this new era that we're living in. One thing I wanted to talk a little bit more about too is, and you've mentioned it a couple of times already, but Schedule 3 and how it could really slow this down. Can you just expound a little bit more on what the potential impact could be?
Sure. So December 2nd, we will have the hearing, and then it will take probably 30 to 60 days for an administrative law judge to make a ruling on that hearing. We know, even with Chevron in existence, that somebody's going to produce litigation and is going to sue either the federal government, probably the federal government, to either stop it or to slow it down. So we knew that litigation was already going to be coming in this process. But because the courts are going to be far more bogged down because there's no Chevron deference, and because the agency is going to have to be more careful, we're going to see a slowdown of this. We're just going to see it. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the boys' lawsuit, and to see what that does with, it's not Chevron related, but to see what that does with the industry. But we're years and years away from that. The courts are already overwhelmed. It takes on an average 6 to 9 years to get through that whole judicial system to actually get a ruling that you can depend on. And the courts are going to be even more overwhelmed than they are now.
Right. And I think that really segues nicely into my next question, which is overall, how do you think that this ruling or overruling will impact the industry's ability to advance and mature? I'm sure you could look at it many different ways, but if you could just kind of share your thoughts on that.
I think it increases the risk profile, right? Like, and even from an enforcement standpoint, if you look at, for example, California right now, the hemp industry just lost the temporary restraining order. But the question there is, and for most companies in cannabis, is what is sort of the risk reward in defining your strategy. In California, they don't have a lot of money to enforce regulations against anyone. So as a company in California, you're probably sitting back saying, am I going to give up my entire business and lose everything? Or am I going to move forward and risk a potential civil penalty, which could be de minimis to whatever the total revenue the company is earning? So in terms of industry maturity, does this help us get to maturity? It depends on how you define maturity. In my mind, a completely mature industry would be an industry that has the ability to access capital, access the capital markets, have banking, do interstate commerce. That would be and do global commerce. That to me would be a fully mature CPG type industry. But it depends on where you're sitting, right? If you're a multi-state operator, I'm not sure interstate commerce benefits you, because you would not need to have cultivation facilities in every state. So I think it depends on where you're sitting. The hemp industry right now, with the ability to engage in interstate commerce, certainly has the capacity to create lots of revenue at a tax deductible amount, which is not what the regulated cannabis markets have access to right now.
Exactly. So, Leah, from your lens, what are some, and I want to spend a little bit of time here, what are some plans and actionable steps that cannabis companies can take, to make sure that they're operating in a business environment, with weakened regulatory agency authority and strengthened judicial authority? What are some things that they can do to kind of set up their business for protection and growth and success and maturity? Sure. And all things?
There's a number of things. I mean, and no matter what the regulatory landscape is, what the legislative landscape is, who's president, who's not president, every single company should be focusing on how can they become operationally efficient within the constraints in which they currently live, period. If you are betting on the hopes and dreams philosophy of cannabis, you are not going to win. You really need to be looking at your metrics, your KPIs. Are you operating effectively? Do you know what it looks like to win as a company? Do you know what your exit is going to be? Are you planning for that exit? Are you strategically gaining assets so that you can be acquired by a specific target or a potential target? Those types of things. Really sit down and figure out what that exit plan looks like now in this arena, even given all of the constraints. Under a less regulated world, and in any world, you really also should be looking at your risk profiles. How risky are you willing to be? One, with your regulated cannabis market side, in terms of your license, and then also on the hemp side, should you be straddling the line like Curaleaf and Cookies and Kiva and other brands that are going into Tilray, that are all going into the hemp cannabinoid space in an attempt to get revenue? And whether that revenue is short term or long term, perhaps it's a good play, but it's something that you really need to sit down with a regulatory advisor, a policy advisor, build a team inside your company that's looking at that, or outsource to regulatory and policy experts that can really help guide you in defining a strategy for the long term and the near term for your company. And right now, where third quarter 2024, you should already be building your strategic plan for 25. And a lot of that should be going to risk profile, especially given the cost of capital right now.
Exactly. I'm curious to know, what might this look like for a larger, say, multi-state operator, multi-state brand versus a small mom and pop operation? How can you kind of look at it through those different lanes in preparing properly?
Sure. A smaller mom and pop or a single state operator that's maybe just a single state retailer isn't going to be as affected by the macro of the entire cannabis market, with the exception of the 280E burden. I mean, especially on the retail side, the 280E burden on the retail side is egregious. If you're a single state operator and you're living in a very localized market, you should be actively engaged with your local regulators, your local cannabis authority, your local cannabis inspector. You should be certainly aware of the federal landscape in terms of cannabis policy and all other types of federal regulations, OSHA, EEOC, federal labor laws, to make sure that you're complying, because those do apply to you. But you can be much more narrow in your scope of focus from a regulatory and legislative policy standpoint than you can if you're a multi-state operator. If you're a multi-state operator, you've already decided you're going to work in multiple markets. You need to be very aware of what is going on in all three branches of the federal government and your individual local markets.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Are there any other kind of macro trends, Leah, that you think the cannabis industry should be looking at that maybe aren't so, clearly tangentially linked to our industry?
I mean, certainly there's the AI trends. I think there's some opportunities inside of tech in particular that can help us build efficiencies inside of our companies. I think Dutchie just launched last week, I believe. They just launched the ability to do sort of more of an AI bud tending thing. And there's another company out there called Genetica that's doing that as well. And from a retail standpoint, one of the problems that I've seen in retail for quite some time in the cannabis world is the inability of a consumer, for example, to be upsold or to be cross-sold to. So if I'm going online to a cannabis dispensary and I'm purchasing whatever I purchase, even though I have an account and that cannabis dispensary recognizes who I am and says, "Hi, Leah," it doesn't say, "Here's what you normally order. Oh, and we're out of stock and you should order this." Or here's what you normally order. How about you try this as well? There's a real lost opportunity in terms of increasing basket sizes because we're not utilizing in consumer intelligence inside of those interfaces. And I think we're going to start seeing some of that coming up, which is nice.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I want to touch on this a little bit too, because we were talking about it previously, but we were talking about kind of a bigger shift toward GMP practices and kind of having a better lens on the way that's moving here in the US. Can you expound on that a little bit as well?
Sure. So GMP are good manufacturing practices. It's something that's required if you're creating food, if you're creating nutraceuticals, if you're creating certainly pharmaceuticals. Having potentially cannabis under Schedule 3, companies should really be looking at getting certified for good manufacturing practices. Now, some states actually require it. In my state, in the state of Maryland, if you're producing a product that I believe has over 10 milligrams of THC in it, you have to be certified as good manufacturing practices. Ultimately, this goes to product safety for the end consumer, but it is a rigorous and onerous process to get certified as a GMP facility. In Europe, you get an even higher standard of care. It's EU GMP, which is a little bit higher than US GMP practices. And in a world where we can export into the European markets, we certainly aren't there yet, but we would all need to be thinking about that. How are we growing it? Do we have good agricultural practices? And do we have EU GMP certified facilities that we can then export globally?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, Leah, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. It really helps, kind of position, our businesses to think about, okay, how can this impact us in the near term? And what are some of these things that we should be looking at in the long view? Because we should always really be looking at both. So thank you so much for sharing your very unique expertise on the topic as well. Is there anything else you'd like to add about Chevron, about macro trends, preparing for the future, anything that we've kind of touched on today?
I think mostly I would just like to reiterate that we are in the early stages of cannabis. We are nowhere near the industry that we can and will be in the future. And I think moving into GMP type practices, really being aware of compliance issues, staying aware of regulatory and legislative issues, and really focusing on operational efficiencies is so incredibly important. And if I could add one more thing, there's a tendency in cannabis a lot, and I think maybe it's because we're entrepreneurs, where we have bright and shiny object syndrome, and we have a tendency to grasp onto things that take us away from our core competencies. And I think it's very, very important for companies to continuously analyze, what is your core competency? What are you really, really good at? And stay focused on that. Go narrow, versus necessarily going wide. And I think that you will be rewarded with much larger revenue in the long term if you can really stay focused.
Absolutely. Wise advice from one of the most experienced folks in the industry, Leah Heise. Thank you so very much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you on Big Ideas with Cannabis.
Thanks.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We appreciate you sitting in on our conversation today. Don't forget to subscribe to the Beard Bros Media Network on YouTube to see this episode and all of our shows. And thank you again so much. Have a great day.